He thought it was just another flight, a quick trip home after a long week of work. But within minutes, everything changed. As Jaden settled into his seat, a woman stopped beside him, her voice sharp and cold. "I'm not sitting there." The cabin fell silent. At first, people thought she was confused. Then came the whispers, the shifting eyes, the uncomfortable tension that filled the air. In that moment, Jaden realized this wasn't about a seat. It was about who was sitting in it. And what happened next would expose a truth many still try to ignore. Even at 30,000 feet, Jaden had always loved flying. For him, every flight was a symbol of how far he'd come. From growing up in a small, working-class neighborhood to now traveling for his career in technology. He'd worked hard to get here. Long nights studying, juggling 2 part-time jobs, and keeping his head high through the quiet prejudices that followed him like shadows. This trip was supposed to be simple. A short flight home after a successful business presentation. A moment to finally breathe. At the airport, everything felt ordinary. The familiar sound of boarding announcements echoed through the terminal. Jaden grabbed a coffee, smiled politely at the barista, and scrolled through pictures of his niece on his phone. He was the kind of man who stayed calm, who believed that if you did right by people, the world would eventually do right by you. As he approached his gate, the crowd buzzed with impatience, people adjusting luggage, making calls, trying to board first. When his row was finally called, Jaden stepped forward, ticket in hand, nodding politely to the flight attendants as he made his way down the narrow aisle. He found his seat by the window and placed his bag neatly overhead, settling in with the quiet satisfaction of someone ready to rest. But then, something shifted. Out of the corner of his eye, he noticed a woman standing still beside his row. Her arms crossed, her expression tight. The flight attendant spoke softly to her, but the woman shook her head, refusing to move. Passengers began to glance over. Whispers started. Jaden didn't know it yet. But this ordinary flight was about to expose something ugly. Something that would test his patience, his dignity, and the decency of everyone on that plane. The woman's voice cut through the quiet hum of the cabin like a blade. "I'm not sitting there," she said firmly, pointing toward Jaden's seat. Her tone wasn't loud, but it carried that kind of sharp, confident voice that demanded attention. The nearby passengers turned, curiosity flickering into judgment. Jaden looked up, unsure if he'd heard correctly. He thought maybe she had the wrong seat. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. But the flight attendant's uneasy smile said otherwise. "Ma'am," the attendant began, keeping her tone calm, "this is your assigned seat." The woman crossed her arms tighter. "Then change it. I'm not sitting next to him." That word, him, hung in the air like a poison. A few people gasped quietly. Others looked down, pretending not to notice. Jaden felt the weight of 100 eyes that refused to truly see him. His pulse quickened, but he stayed silent. He'd learned long ago that sometimes silence was the only shield you had. The attendant tried again. "Ma'am, everyone has assigned seating. If you'd like, I can check for another seat." "But the flight is nearly full." The woman frowned, muttering something about standards and comfort. She refused to move, standing firm in the aisle while the rest of the passengers waited, some growing impatient, others uncomfortable. Jaden sat there, forcing himself to breathe slowly. He thought about all the times he'd faced this, not in words, but in glances, in suspicion, in locked car doors at stoplights. But this time, it wasn't hidden. It was open, unapologetic, and humiliating. Minutes passed. The captain's voice came over the intercom, asking everyone to take their seats so the plane could depart. Still, the woman refused. Finally, the flight attendant walked briskly toward the cockpit. Murmurs rippled through the cabin. Phones began to record. Someone whispered, "This is crazy." Another said, "Man, she's really not sitting next to him." Jaden stared out the window, doing everything he could not to break. He wasn't angry, Not yet. He was tired. Tired of having to prove his humanity over and over again. Then came footsteps. Firm, deliberate. The kind that made people fall silent. The pilot appeared, tall and composed, his uniform crisp, his expression unreadable. He looked at Jaden first, then at the woman still blocking the aisle. "Is there a problem here?" he asked quietly. The woman straightened, gesturing toward Jaden as if she were explaining something reasonable. "Yes, I'm not sitting there. I paid for my ticket, and I don't feel comfortable sitting beside." She didn't finish. She didn't have to. The pilot listened without interrupting. The tension in the cabin was suffocating now. Even the engines seemed to hum more quietly. Waiting. Jaden stayed silent, his hands folded in his lap. For a moment, he thought the pilot might tell him to move, to just let it go, to make it easier for everyone. That's how it usually went. The one who did nothing wrong was always asked to be the bigger person. But the pilot didn't speak yet. He just looked between them, his gaze calm but heavy, as if measuring not just what was happening, but what it meant. The passengers leaned in, their phones still rolling, hearts beating fast. Nobody knew what he was about to say. And in that silence, that thick, uncomfortable pause, Jaden realized that whatever came next could change everything. The pilot stood in the narrow aisle, his gaze steady. Every eye in the cabin was on him. The woman's voice wavered now, her confidence thinning under the silence that pressed against her. "I'm not sitting here," she repeated, quieter this time, but still clinging to the words like armor. "I shouldn't have to." The pilot's jaw tightened. He took a slow breath, and the next moment, his voice filled the cabin. Calm, controlled, but carrying the kind of authority that couldn't be ignored. "Ma'am," he said, "you have two choices. You can take your seat, or you can take the next flight." A hush swept through the passengers. The woman blinked, disbelief flashing across her face. "Excuse me?" The pilot didn't flinch. "We don't tolerate discrimination on this plane." Not from anyone. He turned slightly, gesturing toward Jaden. "That man has every right to that seat, and my crew and I will make sure he's treated with the respect every passenger deserves." Jaden felt his chest tighten, a mix of shock and relief washing over him. He wasn't used to someone stepping in. Not like this, not so decisively. Around him, people exchanged glances, unsure if they should clap, speak, or stay quiet. The woman's lips trembled. She looked around for support that wasn't there. The passengers who had once watched in silence now turned their faces away, refusing to meet her eyes. The isolation she had tried to impose on Jaden now found her instead. The pilot leaned closer, his voice lower now, calm but final. "You can decide, ma'am, but we won't be moving until you do." A long pause followed. Then, without another word, she grabbed her bag and stormed toward the exit, muttering under her breath. The cabin exhaled, a collective release of tension. The pilot turned back to Jaden, gave a small nod, and said simply, "We're glad to have you on board." For the first time in that long, suffocating hour, Jaden smiled. Not out of victory, but out of quiet gratitude. The engines roared to life again. But for everyone on that plane, something far more powerful had just taken off. When the plane finally landed, Jaden sat quietly as passengers gathered their belongings. Some offered small smiles, brief nods, gestures that said, "We saw what happened." A few even whispered words of support as they passed. But most just hurried out, eager to return to normal life. Jaden didn't blame them. He knew that for most, this was just another uncomfortable moment they'd rather forget. But for him, it wasn't something he could simply move past. It was a reminder, one that every black man and woman knows too well, that no matter how successful, polite, or patient you are, there are still people who will see your skin before they see your soul. As he walked through the terminal, the pilot caught up to him. He placed a hand on Jaden's shoulder and said quietly, I'm sorry you had to experience that on my plane. Jaden nodded, not with bitterness, but with a quiet strength. Thank you, he replied, for saying something when others wouldn't. The pilot gave a small nod and walked away. And in that moment, Jaden realized that change doesn't always come from protests or headlines. Sometimes, it begins in moments like this, when one person chooses to stand up for what's right, even when it would be easier to stay silent. But as Jaden looked around the crowded airport, the truth hit him. This story wasn't new. It wasn't rare. It was just another chapter in a book that keeps being written. One filled with pain, endurance, and the constant fight for respect. And so, as he walked out into the sunlight, he made a quiet promise to himself. To keep showing up. To keep existing loudly and proudly in spaces where others might wish he didn't. Because racism doesn't end when the plane lands. It ends when people stop pretending it's not still happening, when silence is no longer an option. So the question is, how many more moments like this will it take before we finally change the way we see one another? Don't miss more powerful real-life stories. Hit subscribe now.